Good evening. It's a great honor to be addressing you from Athens. I speak as an author, as a Philhellean, and as a member of the British Committee for the reunification of the Parthenon marbles. Let's begin by recalling that on the 31st of July, 1801, something absolutely extraordinary happened on the Acropolis. And it would have seemed extraordinary even to those who were following closely the contest between the British and the French to acquire ancient artifacts in the East Mediterranean. And it would have seemed extraordinary even to those British individuals who were most closely involved in those efforts. Let's recall who those individuals were. First and foremost, Thomas Bruce, member of an ancient Scottish family, appointed as ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in his 33rd year in 1799, already an experienced diplomat. And his much younger wife, Mary, who was only 20 when they married in early 1799, and despite her youth, she, in a sense, took Constantinople by storm as a diplomatic spouse, the diplomatic spouse of all diplomatic spouses, an intelligent, headstrong young lady. And then also closely involved was a very intelligent and ruthless young clergyman, scholar, a certain Reverend Philip Hunt, who became a scholar at Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1791, and got a wonderful opportunity as he was graduating with an MA in 1799, when Lord Elgin appointed him chaplain and assistant, and Philip Hunt immediately realized that he had a chance not only to make himself famous, but also to make a fortune. Whatever you might say about Hunt, he was clearly a very good classical scholar. Now, as of the spring of 1801, impatience was growing in the Elgin camp. Artists had been working on the Acropolis since 1800, and they had an ambivalent brief to draw and mould and possibly take away the antiquities. But as of spring 1801, there was a sense that better and smoother access to the Acropolis was needed for that team of artists. They needed a permit, a sort of super permit, which would make sure that no obstacle would be placed in the way of the artists as they worked on the Acropolis. One document was forthcoming, but it wasn't good enough. So as of the spring, early summer of 1801, the Elgin team were dreaming of what they called a firman. In fact, they were using the word in quite a loose sense, because a firman, technically speaking, is a document signed by an Islamic sovereign. In other words, the Sultan in this case. But they used the word rather loosely to refer to any sort of document that was signed by an Ottoman bigwig, not necessarily the Sultan. Now, as of July 1801, it seemed as though they had got what they wanted. As Lady Elgin wrote in a gushing letter to her parents, "Hunt is in raptures, for the firman is perfection. It allows all our artists to go to the citadel, to copy and model everything in it, to erect scaffolds all around the temple, to dig and discover the ancient foundations, and to bring away any marbles that may be deemed curious by their having inscriptions on them." So you can see the spirit of this communication. The emphasis clearly at that time was on digging under the surface of the Acropolis, and in particular in taking away objects, pieces of marble, which had writing on them. And indeed, the same emphasis is discernible in the only version of this document which has ever existed, has ever been made public, and that was an Italian translation, a not very clear Italian translation, which was produced many years later by Philip Hunt. It was apparently specified that when they the British artists wish to take away some pieces of stone with old inscriptions and figures that no opposition be made. Well, you might ask, can there ever be any improvement on perfection? Well, it seems there can, in the sense that what began at the end of July 1801 went much, much further than anybody had dreamed of in early July 1801. Namely, instead of digging in the ground, instead of looking for inscriptions, Elgin's team began a systematic removal of all the high-standing sculptures on the Parthenon that they could get hold of. Here is a watercolour that was apparently made on the evening of the first day of that operation, when they first erected ladders and pulleys and began tearing down the metopes, parts of the frieze, systematically removing the high-standing sculptures. This would have been an enormous surprise to anybody who was following the British efforts in Athens, and it happened for a very particular reason. Philip Hunt had arrived in Athens for a fresh visit on the 22nd of July. It was an exceptionally sweet moment in Anglo-Turkish relations, in the sense that the British had just achieved a spectacular victory in Egypt. Also, the French were apparently preparing to invade Ottoman Greece. And this created a situation, a short-lived situation, where the Ottomans could literally refuse the British nothing. And very artfully, Philip Hunt took advantage of that situation and began a systematic removal, which seemed to go far, far beyond the spirit of the so-called famine. You can sense the triumphant note in Philip Hunt's correspondence with his boss in August 1801, having dispatched the first couple of metopes to England. He assures Elgin that they have beaten the French. That's the important thing. They have got these sculptures which the French would have so liked to have. And secondly, Elgin himself, by acquiring the sculptures, will be held in high esteem in England because he has supposedly improved the national taste. And years later, Hunt would admit the fact that he had made a huge stretch in the meaning of that original document. He had taken advantage of the very, very favourable conjuncture, as he put it, to extend rather than contract the precise permissions of the firman. So you can imagine what a surprise it would have been in late July, August 1801, when this operation to systematically take down the high-standing sculptures began. It was a surprise even to the insiders in the small town of Ottoman Athens. And there are a number of well-known testimonies which reflect that shock. Among the most famous is that of the Anglo-Irish painter Edward Dodwell, who, along with his Italian collaborator Simone Pomardi, left us some of the most beautiful images of late Ottoman Athens. As he recalls, nor have I any hesitation in declaring that the Athenians in general, nay, even the Turks themselves, did lament the ruin that was committed, and loudly and openly blamed their sovereign for the permission that was granted. I was on the spot at the time, and I had an opportunity of observing and even of participating in the sentiment of indignation which such conduct universally inspired. There's another rather similar eyewitness testimony by another man called Edward. This time a certain Reverend Edward Daniel Clark. He was a Cambridge clergyman, but really in spirit more of a geologist, a traveller, a travel writer, and he left us one of the most famous eyewitness accounts. When the last of the metopes was taken from the Parthenon, and a great part of the superstructure with one of the triglyphs was thrown down by the workmen whom Lord Elgin employed, the distar, that's the governor of the Acropolis, who beheld the mischief done to the building, took his pipe from his mouth, dropped a tear, and in a supplicating tone of voice said to Luzieri, the artist, "Telos." I was present. Now, powerful as these testimonies by the two Edwards are, they're also, some would say, tainted by the fact that both these men were themselves collectors, antiquarians. They were both in the business of gathering and removing objects from Greece. So perhaps some of their venom against Elgin and his works was motivated by jealousy. So for myself, a testimony that I somewhat prefer is a more innocent one, offered by a young budding politician, a young man on the Grand Tour, who had a great sympathy for Greece and would go on to play a short but distinguished role in British politics. This is a certain Frederick Sylvester North Douglas, grandson of the Lord North, who was Prime Minister when the American colonies were lost. He died very young, unfortunately, at the age of 28, but he left us a very sympathetic essay on his experiences in Athens, recalling, as he put it, certain points of resemblance between the ancient and modern Greeks. That alone marks him out among these early travellers. He had a very shrewd sense of the politics which had allowed Philip Hunt to undertake such a huge operation. At the time when Lord Elgin was our ambassador at the port, our Egyptian victories had raised the English interest of that court to an unexampled height, and the whole of that influence was publicly and privately exerted for the permission to carry off the Athenian marbles. So he understood the politics very well. He was also very articulate in denouncing the argument which said, "If we don't take them, the French will." He thought that was a bad argument. It would be thought a strange defence in a pickpocket that he only stole a pocket handkerchief because he knew his friend Bill Soames was waiting to take it if he did not. I like Frederick Sylvester North Douglas. Now, he made his grand tour between 1810 and 1812. That means that he was hard on the heels of the most famous northern traveller in Athens of all, and that, of course, was Lord Byron, who arrived in the city as a very young man on Christmas Day 1809, and he brought to his observation of the city all the passion and the vision of a young, undisciplined, zestful man who saw things that other people didn't. He saw, above all, that the marvellous cultural products of Golden Age Athens cannot be separated from the glorious physical landscape that nurtured those products. The mountains, the rivers, the landscapes, the views of Attica. He despised what he called antiquarianism. In other words, this idea that you could just gather up stones and bring them to northerly places and somehow the stardust, the magic would remain. He located the Greek genius in the Greek landscape, and that alone would be a reason for us to be profoundly grateful to Lord Byron. Now, Lord Byron proceeded to pen, in relation to Lord Elgin, two of the most savage pieces of satire ever written in the English language. Now, one of them was the poem that made him famous, whose first instalment in 1812 turned him instantly to a superstar, not just in England, but across Europe. It was the first instalment of a long narrative poem about a traveller, a bit like Byron himself, who was disillusioned with the age he lived in, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Now, as a playful literary device, and maybe because of his own unhappy childhood in Aberdeen, Byron places great stress on the fact that Lord Elgin, his nemesis, came from the freezing northern extremes of Great Britain, the land of the Picts and the Scots. And he makes the case that this latter-day Pict has actually done worse things to the Parthenon than were done in the year 396, when the notorious barbarian army under Alaric the Goth, rampaged through the city. So worse things were done by this Pict, this man from the far north of Scotland, than were ever done by the Goths or the Turks. It's a very, very cruel and powerful piece of satire. And he went on, he didn't stop there. He wrote another satire that was so biting that initially he intended it to be circulated only privately. But it did, of course, get out to the public, and it remains an important part of Byron's works. Now here, he plays with the idea that two Greek goddesses who didn't normally get along, who were normally rivals, actually joined forces to take a terrible revenge on Lord Elgin. First of all, Athena, the goddess whose temple has been spoliated, and secondly, Aphrodite, or Venus, the goddess of love. These two rival deities gang up to take their revenge on Elgin. This, of course, was a very savage reference to the fact that Elgin had by this time been involved in a very messy public divorce. He had fallen out with Mary Nisbet. He had accused her of adultery, and she then married the third party, a certain Robert Ferguson. So he was one of Europe's most famous cuckolds. And it also hinted at the fact that the disfigurement of Elgin's face was possibly a punishment for some sexual sins of his own. So truly the goddess of love had not been kind to Elgin, and Byron makes this point in his own savage way. With extraordinary prescience, Byron goes on to intuit that not just Elgin, but the whole British Empire will be punished for the arrogant way in which it has treated so-called subject peoples. He predicts the Indian mutiny, the Indian uprising, which would take place more than 40 years later. He predicts how bloody it will be, an extraordinary piece of intuition and prescience, uncanny prescience on the part of Lord Byron. He suggests that it's hypocritical for Britain to present itself as a nation which rejects slavery, but it in turn enslaves other people. A very, very powerful and early piece of anti-colonial writing. So these are the two works with which Byron denounced his fellow Scottish peer, Lord Elgin. Now, he was perfectly right, of course, in saying that Elgin's life had been ruined, and had been ruined for reasons very much connected with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, because his divorce settlement was an absolute disaster for his finances. Initially, Mary Nisbet had been a great asset because her money was going to provide the resources to buy the marbles, to pay the necessary bribes, to pay for the transport of the marbles. He now found himself bankrupt, and he found himself in possession of marbles that he could not afford to keep, and he made a desperate appeal to the British state, the British exchequer, to take these marbles off his hands. And this process began in 1815, and it led in 1816 to a series of debates and parliamentary hearings in which the parliamentarians considered whether or not it was worth spending public money and how much money on acquiring those sculptures from Lord Elgin. Now, we know the end result. We know that the Parliament did eventually decide to buy the marbles for £35,000, which was half the amount that Elgin was looking for. And this was still a disaster for the Scottish peer. So we know the result, but it's worth recalling that at every material time there were countervailing voices. There were voices in Parliament that said we should not be rewarding Lord Elgin in this way. This is not the right use of public money. So in the last part of my presentation, I will just recall what some of those counter-arguments were. Now, let's begin playfully by recalling that in the year 2025, and indeed in the year 2019, democracies had very strong views on the extent to which diplomats and people sent abroad to represent their country should be allowed to make themselves rich, to acquire assets of their own in the course of their duties. Recall that in 2019, an American Secretary of State provoked a serious scandal when he accepted a bottle of whiskey from the Japanese, which he then couldn't account for. Now, it was very good whiskey, admittedly, but it shows perhaps a much more sensitive nose for the abuse of office by diplomats than anybody had in Lord Elgin's time. And yet, it's striking that many of the initial questions to Lord Elgin during these parliamentary hearings were focusing on the fact that he had used the privilege of his role as an ambassador to acquire things for his private possession that he could not possibly have done if he were not ambassador. He had, of course, Elgin saw himself as a benefactor to the so-called national taste of Britain, because he thought that the mere fact of bringing these sculptures to Britain, even to his private residence, would somehow improve the standard of sculpture in Britain. But on the contrary, he was grilled over and over again by the parliamentarians. Is it the case that you acquired these sculptures because you were ambassador? And is it the case that you could not have acquired them if you were not ambassador? That was one of the most serious issues raised. Now, another line of argument, interestingly, is that this was the wrong use of public money at the time when there was great hardship in the land. There were many war veterans from the recent Napoleonic Wars who were living in great hardship, and that was partly because after some very cold winters, the price of grain had skyrocketed and people were literally looking for bread to eat. And there was a famous cartoon at the time which said, "Why on earth should John Bull," England in other words, "be spending money on stones when all his many family members wanted was bread?" That was one eloquent line of argument. One of the first parliamentarians to speak out and denounce Elgin and to speak of the dangerous precedent that would be set was a certain Sir John Newport, a Liberal politician who began life in his native Ireland, holding high office there, and then transferred his political base to London. Now, he was a bit confused, perhaps, about the nature of the sculptures and their significance, but nonetheless, he did have a very clear sense of the bad precedent that would be set if Elgin was authorised to acquire objects for his own benefit, if retroactively somehow this act of appropriation was approved. It seems to have been reserved for an ambassador of this country to take away what Turks and other barbarians considered sacred. It was the duty of the House to ascertain the truth of these matters, for otherwise, in case they should assent to purchase the collection, they would evidently sanction acts of public robbery. Now, another more eccentric objector, if you like, was a certain Richard Payne Knight, who was considered at the time a serious art scholar, art historian, and a member of a group of people called the Dilettanti, who had actually done good work in previous decades to draw and present the treasures of antiquity without taking them away. So the Dilettanti were good people, but I'm afraid Richard Payne Knight was not a good representative of them. In fact, he was so confused that he actually thought that the marbles weren't up to much. They were just sort of cheap Roman copies. In what class of art do you place the finest works of this collection? I should put them in the second rank. They're very unequal. Only the finest I would put in the second rank, the others even lower. Well, how wrong can you be? But nonetheless, he was part of the debate as well. For myself, the parliamentarian whose testimony I most appreciate is one of the last speakers in the debates of 1816 about the marbles. Now, he, like Lord Byron, foresaw the day when there would be other stakeholders in this debate, when it wouldn't just be a debate between the Ottomans, the British taxpayer, between Lord Elgin, that Athens would have new masters. And he suggested that there be an amendment to the decision by Parliament which stated, "Great Britain holds these marbles only in trust till they are demanded by the present or any future possessors of the city of Athens, and upon such demand engages without question or negotiation to restore them as far as can be effected to the places from whence they came, and that they shall be in the meantime carefully preserved." Surely this is the noblest voice of all in the debates of 1816 about the marbles. Now I want to finish on a slightly different note by observing that of all the testimonies from travellers from the north, I prefer those who listened with a sympathetic ear to the voices of the local Greeks. In other words, they were not just speaking for themselves, but they were listening to local sentiment and picking it up. One such voice was Frederick Douglass, of course. He was very attuned to local sentiment. Another, perhaps reluctantly, was Byron's friend John Hobhouse, who was told by a learned Greek, "Keep those marbles carefully because we'll be asking for them back one day." But as a final voice of sympathetic listening and transmission, I want to share with you the testimony of an eccentric, a highly eccentric Anglo-Irish poet who visited Athens in 1840. Aubrey de Vere wrote hundreds of poems, none of which are remembered, but he should be remembered for what he observed during his visit to Athens, which was the extreme disturbance of heart, as he put it, among ordinary Athenian people about, in particular, the caryatid which Elgin had carried off. And he reports, and he's not the only one, there are other travellers who report this story. He reports the story told by ordinary people about the caryatid and about the pain suffered by her 5 sisters. On the second night of her captivity, her 5 remaining sisters were heard to lament with loud sobbings her fate and their own loss. All night long, as the story goes, the voice of lamentation was echoed among the pillars and wafted eastward over the sea. I would like, in conclusion, to assure you that, despite my surname, I am no relation whatever to Edward Daniel Clarke, who, apart from giving a good testimony of what happened on the Acropolis, is also notorious for taking away a 2-ton sculpture from Eleusis. However, I do happen to be the great-great-great-great nephew of Sir John Newport, mentioned earlier, and I'm quite proud of that.